Meanwhile, as you went to the left, on the moderate left, you had the classical liberals. So people who believed that we don't need kings to tell us what to do. We need a greater space for individual liberty and liberty in trade. And as you went further and further left, people got more and more radical along those individualist principles. At the very far left, you had two really interesting figures in particular by a few decades into the 19th century, sitting on the left. One of them you may have heard of before is Frédéric Bastiat, the great French free market economist, who wrote all kinds. He's the one who is commonly credited with coming up with the broken window fallacy, the critique of the broken window fallacy. He's also the one who said that law is that great fiction by which one class of people, or that everyone convinces themselves that they can live upon the labor of other people. Meanwhile, also on the left was a man named Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, who was the first political thinker ever to describe himself seriously as an anarchist. Anarchism had been used as an insult up to this point, and Pierre-Joseph Proudhon was the first man who was sort of willing to say, yeah, I'm an anarchist, and what about it? Who was willing to say that the reason you think anarchy is a bad thing is actually the reason it's a good thing, because it gets rid of all the privileges and stupid laws that you're trying to protect. And so if you look at the way that this spectrum worked, from the royalists and the absolutists and the conservatives on the right side out to the liberals, and then on the far left you had the radical individualists, the free marketeers and the anarchists. The way that it worked was really that you did have a left-right spectrum, but it's not the spectrum we think of today. It's not the spectrum between, those statists who want to steal your money so that they can provide you with care that you don't want to get, versus those statists who think that they ought to beat you up and steal your money so that they can blow up children in Iraq or beat up people here in the US. But rather it was a spectrum from, not between statists, but from statism out to anti-statism at the far end. That it went from those who were for established power and for the power of the government out to those who believed in absolute individual liberty and voluntary cooperation and free association above all things. A society based on spontaneous and voluntary cooperation rather than on social control. And so in an important sense, as I see it, libertarianism, and especially the form of libertarianism that we ought to be advocating, the most consistent form, which is free market anarchism, is in fact a view not of the right, but of the extreme left. Farther left by far than anybody in government who calls themselves a leftist. Farther left than those who have anti-authoritarian impulses in sort of the anti-war movement or the various other radical movements, but who then turn around to the state as a solution for the social problems that they see. As far left as you can possibly get, because we believe in freedom both as a means and as an end. That this is our ultimate goal, and it's also how we intend to achieve that goal, not by aggressing against anyone, but by making ourselves fully free. Now, what's the point of mentioning all this? Well, there's sort of a semantic point, right, which is just about the historical meanings of words, but I think there's much more than just a semantic point. It's not just a matter of trying to recover some obsolete meaning of the word left in order to try and sex up some conventional set of libertarian policy positions. The thinking of ourselves as people of the left should actually change how we think of ourselves as political actors and as people seeking total freedom. It should change who we think of as our natural allies, who we think of as our primary enemies, our relationship to the socioeconomic status quo, and also our analysis of the problems that we face, the causes of those problems, and the solutions that we need. A libertarianism that's of the left, that's freed itself from the dead hand of conservatism and right-wing identifications, is in fact a movement that's for radical social transformation, a move that's for society based on the fully free expression of people's possibilities. And a movement which is fundamentally actually about equality. Well, what do I mean by equality? This is a word that's used to be very popular with the libertarian movement, but over the past century has become very unpopular. If anything, egalitarianism is usually something that's used as an insult rather than a term of praise. Well, what I mean by equality is not the kind of trifling equality that you hear from those who believe that government should come in and force everybody to make the same income or to have the same set of socioeconomic opportunities starting out, or those who think that everybody ought to be equal before the law. Of course, it's true that everybody ought to be equal before the legal system, but if that's all you got, that's not much, right? If everybody is being enslaved and beaten and oppressed equally, it's not much consolation. And so what we as libertarians want, what was actually being called for by thinkers like Locke and thinkers like Jefferson when he was in one of his good moods, and by other radical, and by the French revolutionaries who called for liberty, equality, and fraternity, was not these kinds of equality, but rather a more fundamental equality. It was an equality of political authority. What do I mean by that? I mean by equality of political authority that you're viewing society not as divided into superior and inferior classes. There's no notion that there's one class of people who were born with saddles on their backs so that they could be ridden by the other. But rather a society without kings, without masters, with just folks, just people, all of us. That we are not just equal before the legal system, that we don't just get the same raw deal from the courts, but they were actually equal with the people who make up the legal system. That when those people assert a right to rule us and to invade our liberty without our consent, and even though we haven't violated the liberty of anyone else, that we should treat those people not as representatives of a higher authority, but rather simply as criminals, as people who are invading against us in the same way that a mugger or any other criminal invades against us. And so once we sort of see ourselves as advocates of equality in particular, of this kind of equality, revolutionary equality of political authority, that should substantially change sort of how we see ourselves relating to the powers that be and on a number of questions of strategy. This is also incidentally key to, I think, how the Wobblies worked, right? They didn't think, oh, well, we've got to petition, please, Mr. City Councilman, won't you change the law? It's just, look, you're doing this and it's not going to stand. And so they stood up to them as human beings to other human beings and made it impractical for the governors to go on doing what they were doing. And so in terms of what libertarians should look to as what we're concerned with and what we should prioritize, I think that this makes sort of recognizing that we're fundamentally about liberty and equality should fundamentally change who we see as the people we're trying to reach out to, who we should see as the people that we're coming up against. Who are our natural allies and our natural enemies? Is it those who are sort of most powerful and most privileged under the current socioeconomic status quo? Or should it be the people who are the most marginalized, the most exploited and oppressed, and the most invaded upon by government? I think that it has to be the latter, not the former. There are strategic reasons for why, which we may talk about, but also there are just practical reasons why. That in addition to strategic and practical reasons, there are also just basic reasons of consistency, because what we're for is overturning this system that elevates some above others, and creating something new amongst ourselves in which we can interact on an equal basis. So as a result, I think that in terms of priorities, we need to start talking about shifts that we might make to our priorities, and shifts in emphasis that tie in with a number of goals that are actually traditionally associated with the political left, but that the statist left over the past century has managed to corrupt and confuse by trying to take basically just ends and accomplish them through coercive means. As libertarians, though, we should go for the just ends. We just need to change the means so that they're anti-statist rather than statist means. And so, for example, I think that it's crucially important that libertarians be radically and unapologetically anti-war, against all forms of government war, simply because war itself is the most concerted, most pure expression of state violence and state control. The notion that the right of one collective to hurl itself against another collective in order to deal with some question of collective interests, like political boundaries or the economic interests of the bailed out classes, at the expense of systematically violating and destroying the lives and livelihoods of innocent people, both innocent individuals, both in the country that's being attacked as they have bombs rained down on them and their homes destroyed in the interests of war objectives, and also at home, as those of us who oppose the war are forced to fund it nevertheless through taxation. those who come out vocally against the war are often repressed, and the clampdown on civil